June 1944. In a dimly lit control room along Japan's coast, radar operators leaned over glowing screens. At first they thought it was a glitch, impossible echoes high above the Pacific. But the blips grew stronger, steady, undeniable. Something massive was approaching, flying at altitudes no American plane had ever dared. Messages flashed across command networks. Squadrons scrambled to intercept. Engines roared awake on the runways. Japan's air defense machine was mobilizing for what it thought would be another routine defense against B-17s or carrier-based raids. But as the black silhouettes finally pierced through the haze and climbed higher, Japanese pilots immediately felt the difference. These were not B-17s, nor the familiar Liberators. The machines gleamed silver in the sunlight, engines humming with effortless power. Their wings stretched wide, their bellies swollen with promise of destruction. The B-29 Superfortress had arrived. As Zero and Ki-44 fighters clawed desperately toward them, the thin air became the first enemy. Carburetors sputtered, engines lost power, guns froze in the cold upper atmosphere. Pilots struggled to even bring their sights to bear as the bombers continued serenely onward, seemingly immune to interception. It was as though a new era of warfare had materialized overnight, and the defenders were trapped in the wrong decade. At that moment, doctrine shattered. Japan had prepared for enemies to come low and close, vulnerable to interception. But the B-29s soared far above, cruising in a realm Japanese aircraft were never designed to reach. One radar operator later admitted he could barely believe it. "We watched them pass overhead like castles in the sky, untouchable." This was no longer about a single mission. It was about a revelation. Japan's skies were no longer safe. And as you'll see in this story, that moment rewrote the future of the Pacific War. If you're fascinated by this forgotten chapter, make sure to like, share, and subscribe as we journey deeper into history. The first Japanese squadrons scrambled with confidence. Veterans of years of combat believed they could turn back any American raid. Pilots of the Ki-84 Hayate, the fastest and most advanced fighter in the Imperial arsenal, tightened their harnesses and accelerated into the sky. Yet within minutes, that confidence evaporated. The Hayate was formidable at medium altitudes, able to duel Mustangs or Thunderbolts on equal terms. But the B-29s weren't waiting at those levels. They climbed higher, 30,000 feet and beyond, where engines gasped for oxygen and performance collapsed. Hayates began to wheeze and stall, their speed dropping dangerously. Zeros and Ki-43 Oscars, even lighter and more outdated, struggled even more, their controls mushy and unresponsive. What had once been agile machines became sluggish targets in the thin stratosphere. One pilot later wrote that the bombers appeared like mountains drifting across the sky. He and his comrades fired bursts that fizzled out before reaching their mark. The B-29s seemed to absorb the desperate streams of tracers without even flinching. Defensive fire from the Superfortress's remote-controlled gun turrets, automated, precise, and deadly, spat back with devastating effect. Several interceptors were shredded in seconds, plummeting to the waves below. Frustration spread across Japanese airfields. Ground controllers shouted orders, demanding higher climbs, tighter formations, braver attacks. But bravery alone couldn't overcome physics. The Empire's entire fighter fleet had been designed for a different kind of war, one where close-range dogfights and kamikaze dives could decide the outcome. Against high-altitude fortresses that cruised serenely above the clouds, those tactics dissolved into futility. For the first time, Japanese pilots faced an enemy they couldn't physically reach. It wasn't just a technical defeat, it was a psychological one. Veteran aces who once dominated the Pacific now returned from missions shaken, humiliated, and in some cases, silent. They knew they had witnessed something more than bombers. They had seen the horizon of air warfare shift beyond their grasp. The B-29 was not just a weapon, it was a messenger. It declared to Japan's defenders, "Your skies belong to us now." From the ground, the B-29 looked like no aircraft Japan had ever faced. Its vast fuselage gleamed in the morning sun, Four massive Wright R-3350 engines propelling it forward with a low, commanding hum. Civilians craned their necks as the formations drifted overhead, gliding as if carried by invisible currents. To those watching below, they appeared less like planes and more like floating fortresses, cities of steel in the sky. What stunned Japanese observers most was the altitude. At nearly 6 miles up, the bombers were little more than glints of silver light. Anti-aircraft crews adjusted their guns, but even the best flak batteries struggled to reach that high. Shells burst beneath the formations, harmless puffs of smoke far from their targets. The defenders had been rendered spectators in their own homeland. Inside the superfortresses, American crews felt the tension of history. Each bomber was an engineering marvel, carrying more than 10 tons of bombs across oceans once thought uncrossable. Remote-controlled turrets, guided by sophisticated analog computers, gave gunners unprecedented accuracy. For the first time, bomber crews could defend every approach, above, below, or from the sides, without blind spots. Japanese pilots discovered this the hard way. When a lone interceptor attempted a steep climb toward a trailing B-29, a burst of .50 caliber fire shredded its wings before it even closed the distance. The bomber never broke formation, never wavered from its course. The sight horrified onlookers. An enemy machine so untouchable it could casually swat aside attackers and continue to glide forward as though nothing had happened. Reports filtered back to Tokyo describing the encounters in tones of disbelief. "The enemy moves where we cannot follow," one commander admitted. What Japan had assumed would be another contest of skill and bravery instead became a demonstration of technological supremacy. The Superfortress was not just an aircraft, it was a symbol of industrial might, one that dwarfed the empire's shrinking resources. That day, as the formations faded into the distance, the truth became undeniable. Japan's doctrine of air defense, carefully built over years of war, was obsolete the moment the B-29 appeared. When the first wave of B-29s thundered toward Tokyo, the city's defenders rushed to their posts, convinced they could repel another raid. Anti-aircraft crews loaded shells in frantic rhythm, while fighter squadrons scrambled from nearby bases. Yet within minutes, the scale of the problem became terrifyingly clear. The formations approached not from a carrier group lurking offshore, but from a distant island, Saipan. Over 1,500 miles away, a base so far removed that Japanese planners had once dismissed it as irrelevant. No aircraft, they insisted, could strike the capital from such a distance. But the Superfortress had shattered that assumption. As the bombers crossed the coastline, the defenders opened fire. Explosions blossomed far below the formations, each detonation a desperate attempt to claw the sky. Tracer fire arced upward in graceful but futile streaks, fading long before reaching their mark. Above the chaos, the B-29s flew on, serene and unhurried, as if the war beneath their wings didn't exist. Tokyo's residents looked skyward with disbelief. Children pointed at the tiny silver dots while mothers dragged them toward shelters. Soldiers shouted warnings across the city, their voices drowned by the distant growl of engines. For many civilians, this was the first moment they truly felt exposed. Japan had always prided itself on being an island fortress, shielded by distance. That shield had been ripped away in a single afternoon. Japanese fighter pilots who managed to reach altitude found themselves outmatched. Their guns frosted over, their engines gasped, and every climb left them weaker. When they finally broke through the clouds, the bombers loomed above, untouchable giants. Some pilots tried head-on attacks, diving through defensive fire in suicidal desperation. Most never returned. That day, Tokyo's skies revealed a grim future. The city could be reached at will, its defenses brushed aside. Leaders in underground bunkers received reports with growing horror. Japan AS capital was no longer beyond the reach of American power. The war had crossed a threshold, and nothing would ever return to the way it had been. For years, Japan's air defense doctrine had been rooted in proximity. Enemy fleets, it was believed, would always come close, carrier groups pushing into the Pacific, or bombers flying from nearby islands. The Imperial Army and Navy had designed their fighters, radars, and flak networks around that assumption. When the B-29 appeared, that foundation collapsed in an instant. The shock rippled through command posts across the homeland. Reports described aircraft approaching from impossible ranges, flying altitudes that nullified interception. In briefings, staff officers stared at maps, tracing the Superfortress's route from newly captured islands. It was a straight line across an ocean once thought too vast to matter. The Americans had turned geography itself into an ally. Doctrines of interception required fast climbs and coordinated fighter screens. But Japan's most advanced aircraft were ill-suited for thin air combat. The Ki-84, deadly at lower levels, grew sluggish above 30,000 feet. The Ki-44, designed as a high-altitude interceptor, lacked the endurance to patrol long distances. Zeros, once the terror of the Pacific, were hopeless against bombers that cruised far beyond their limits. Anti-aircraft defenses fared no better. Guns strained upward, but accuracy dwindled as shells burst harmlessly below their targets. Ammunition stocks were already depleted from years of war, and firing blindly into empty sky drained them further. Every attempt to adapt seemed futile. Commanders grew desperate. New tactics were drafted: frontal assaults, ramming maneuvers, even suicide climbs where pilots intentionally aimed to crash into the formations. Some called it bravery, others despair. In truth, it was an acknowledgement that conventional doctrine was dead. The B-29 was not simply an aircraft, it was a strategic revelation. Japan realized too late that an enemy with industrial capacity could rewrite the rules of distance and altitude. No longer could the nation's leaders reassure their people that the homeland was unreachable. The arrival of the Superfortress stripped away that illusion forever. From that day, Japan's military planners faced a terrifying reality. Their once proud air force was no longer a shield, but a brittle shell waiting to be cracked. Every mission against the B-29 carried with it a cruel arithmetic. Japanese pilots climbed into their cockpits, knowing the odds were stacked against them. Fuel shortages meant many couldn't even reach the altitude of engagement. Those who did often discovered their aircraft sluggish and unreliable in the thin, freezing air. By the time they spotted the formations, exhaustion and fear had already set in. Some pilots pressed their attacks with grim determination. They rolled into head-on dives, aiming directly for the glistening bombers. A few managed to score hits, riddling a Superfortress with cannon fire. But success was fleeting. Remote-controlled turrets responded with precise, devastating bursts. More often than not, attackers were torn apart before they closed to firing range. Survivors returned to base shaken, describing it as fighting against mountains with bare hands. As the raids intensified, desperation spawned new orders. Interceptors were told to ram the bombers if all else failed. Young men, some barely trained, were instructed to give their lives by turning their aircraft into guided missiles. This tactic, born of despair rather than strategy, rarely worked. A handful of B-29s were brought down, but the cost in pilots and planes was staggering. Ground crews watched their comrades take off, fully aware many would never return. The silence of empty runways after each raid became unbearable. One mechanic recalled counting the missing aircraft at dusk, whispering the names of friends he knew were gone forever. For the American crews inside the Superfortresses, the danger was still real. Flak bursts rattled their bomb bays, and the occasional interceptor came screaming in close enough to spray gunfire. Men in those bombers felt the tremors of hits and prayed their formation would hold. But unlike the Japanese, they fought with the assurance of overwhelming numbers, deep reserves, and machines designed to endure punishment. The battles over Japan's skies were not duels of equals. They were a tragic grind, where bravery met futility, and every mission drained the spirit of a nation running out of both men and machines. By late 1944, the missions no longer focused on precision targets alone. The B-29's vast bomb bays carried not just high explosives, but incendiaries designed to consume entire districts. When the Silver Fortresses approached, civilians no longer watched with curiosity. They ran, knowing what followed would turn night into nightmare. On March 9, 1945, Tokyo faced its darkest trial. Hundreds of B-29s swept in low under cover of darkness, dropping tens of thousands of incendiary canisters. The effect was apocalyptic. Wooden houses and narrow streets ignited instantly, flames racing faster than anyone could outrun. Firestorms ripped through neighborhoods, sucking oxygen from the air and turning the city into a furnace. Over 100,000 people perished in a single night, more than in many of the war's battles. From the air, American crews watched the glow spread across the horizon, a living sea of fire. Smoke rose in towering columns, visible even from miles away. The men knew they were witnessing devastation on a scale beyond imagination. Some whispered in disbelief, while others sat in grim silence. For them, the mission was both a triumph of strategy and a haunting reminder of the war's cruelty. For Japanese defenders, the night raids were worse than daytime assaults. Radar and searchlights struggled to track the high-flying formations, while exhausted pilots attempted blind interceptions. Few succeeded. Those who did find the bombers often never returned, consumed by defensive fire or by the sheer chaos of flying through burning skies. The raids broke more than cities. They broke morale. Families huddled in shelters, emerging to find their neighborhoods reduced to ash. Survivors spoke of silence in the mornings, a silence broken only by the sound of collapsing beams and smoldering ruins. For many, it felt as though the heavens themselves had turned against them. The firebombing campaigns proved what the B-29 represented. Not just superiority in altitude and range, but in destructive capacity. No city was beyond reach, no defense strong enough. Japan was burning, and everyone knew it. By the summer of 1945, Japan's air defense was no longer a shield. It was a shadow. Each raid drained what little strength remained, leaving the skies emptier, the response weaker, and the losses harder to replace. Pilots once hailed as guardians of the empire now faced impossible odds, climbing into cockpits with the knowledge that their sacrifice would not stop the Silver Armadas above. The B-29 had achieved what no weapon before it had managed. It stripped away the illusion of safety. From Tokyo to Nagoya, from Osaka to Kobe, every city lay vulnerable beneath wings that spanned oceans. Geography, once Japan's strongest ally, had been rendered irrelevant. The Pacific was no longer a moat, it was a highway. But the Superfortress's story did not end with firebombs alone. In August 1945, 2 B-29s carried the most destructive weapons in history to Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The atomic missions, flown from the same island bases, revealed the final evolution of air power, a single aircraft delivering devastation equal to entire fleets. When Japanese leaders convened in shock after Nagasaki, many admitted what they had long feared. The empire's skies were lost the moment the B-29 appeared. Everything after was only confirmation. For American crews, the Superfortress became a symbol of endurance and resolve. It represented not only engineering brilliance, but also the vast industrial capacity of a nation that could build thousands of such machines and send them across the globe. For Japan, it was the embodiment of helplessness, a reminder that no matter how brave its defenders, technology and resources would decide the war. Even today, the sight of a B-29 carries with it a shadow of awe and dread. To the generation that lived beneath its wings, it was more than a bomber. It was a fortress in the sky, rewriting the very definition of warfare. And in June 1944, when Japanese pilots first looked up and saw those silver giants drifting untouchably above, they realized the truth. The world had entered a new era, and their nation's destiny would never be the same.